The Organ Historical Society is an international organization of people that have a particular passion towards preserving the organ in the culture of the United States. It is important to preserve pipe organs because they are part of the world culture. They're a part of the time continuum of musical instruments, and they are one of the oldest instruments in the world. And there's nothing that quite comes close to a real acoustical instrument. No, you simply cannot duplicate digitally, electronically, any other possible way the realism of an acoustical instrument and the way it evokes the air around you and the emotion of the listener. When I first heard a pipe organ that I remember, I was 4, being trotted out in some church event where all the little kids were being trotted out in front of the congregation for something or other. And it was during the playing of a hymn. And this woman was playing this 1860 hook, which I'd never been cognizant of hearing an organ before, and I just took a beeline out of the group of kids that were being ushered over to this other spot, and people were just like, oh. And I just ran up to the organ, and I was just fascinated. And when they tried to take me away, I started screaming and grabbing onto the woman. So they let me sit there through the whole church service, because when they tried to make me leave, I wouldn't go. And I was just captivated by just the awesomeness of it. There is something about the sound of a pipe organ that strikes people at a visceral, emotional level that no other instrument can quite duplicate. I mean, people can be overcome by the beauty of a violin or the human voice or the majesty of an orchestra, but there's something about the pipe organ that it raises the hair on the back of people's necks. And people may not necessarily be cognizant of organs outside of the church situation, although they have a very definite secular history. But people associate the pipe organ with a feeling of majesty and awe. And those are reactions that people have on an emotional, visceral level. I mean, it gets to people right inside. The younger generation, who's never been exposed to a really good pipe organ, is missing out on this emotional, visceral experience that you can get from a musical instrument. I mean, they might be overcome by, 500 watt decibel sound coming out of a rock band or something, and they have an emotional reaction to that. But they're losing the majesty of the history of human musical interaction, 500 years of magnificent music making, of some of the greatest musical geniuses that have ever existed, and they all had an emotional connection with the instrument because it was the greatest emotional experience they could have in their time with an emotionally with an instrument. And whether it was Bach or Mozart or Sibelius, it doesn't matter who it was, they've all had an emotional connection with the organ at some point in their past. And the younger generation is missing out on that emotional, visceral, physical connection to a musical instrument. I have no idea why musicians would accept an artificially produced compromise of an acoustical instrument. It's such a grating, unmusical sound. And they are really phenomenally good musicians for whom this artificial sound is acceptable. And it's a complete mystery to me why the artificial banality of the sound is acceptable to them. The only possible reason that I can figure that people accept this is because they can create an instrument of immense size that would be way beyond the physical limitations or the budgetary limitations of a particular place to afford. And so they all want to pretend that they are cathedral organists playing some monumentally famous and huge organ in some monumentally famous huge cathedral, and they're doing it in their living rooms. And it's self-ego gratification is all it is. The reason I think that we are stewards of these magnificent musical instruments is because they're built of, inert materials that last for hundreds of years, centuries. It's not a disposable instrument like the modern digital instrument is. And so we, in our, 50 to 75 to 80 years of existence, we're just passing through the lives of these instruments that are going to last for centuries. And it's our responsibility to take care of them and to preserve them and help them to get from the point that we met them to the point that we hand them off to somebody else. Because they're always going to be here if you let them stand here. And we're just passing through, and they're watching us come and go. Europe's respect for old buildings, and particularly old pipe organs in general, has no comparison to the United States. The Europeans, who have a history that goes back thousands of years, they jealously guard this history. You go into a city like Rome, and you find them preserving one brick, one stone out of a building, and they're putting it in the facade of a new building. And the Americans, with a history that maybe goes back 3 centuries, where our national mentality was one of improvement and new is better, more is better, etc. We just constantly trash things and throw them away and think that something newer and bigger is always better, and it's not. And the Europeans look at us and they're flabbergasted why we can throw away so much of our history, our culture, our past, these markers of where we've been, where we've come from, because you have no idea where you are or where you're going if you don't look back at where you've come from and be mindful of it and respect it. American organ building has sort of mirrored the international prominence of the country. It started out when the United States was a frontier wilderness, and whatever organs we had, we imported from Europe. And then gradually, a builder here, a builder 500 miles away, they started crafting these small instruments for these frontier outposts. And as the country grew and developed, the organ building industry in the country developed with it, so that at one point in time in the 19th century, the largest organ building factory in the world was in New York City, which was probably the fastest growing city in the world. And as the United States culture has matured and developed and grown, and where to the point now we are like one of the leading powers of the world, American organ building is now really the best organ building going on in the world. The Europeans look at Americans for direction as to the state of the art, the very best building of the pipe organ that is going on, and it's happening right here. And it started from these humble beginnings of just a handful of people working in the frontier. Pipe organs are works of art. They've been handcrafted for a particular place, in a particular acoustic, and the pipe organ is probably the only thing left like this that is still handcrafted the same way it was done 500 years ago. It can't be produced by machines. The art of physically rolling up a pipe and soldering it and putting it together. The organ behind me has 33,000 pipes, and every single one of them was made by hand. They would have to have been made by hand 500 years ago, and they'd have to be made by hand now the exact same way they were 500 years ago. When you have something that is this personal to its creator, and this specific to its place of origin, it is a genuine work of art. And to throw a work of art away is to discard a valuable piece of art history. And once you've lost it, you can't ever get it back. There's a famous book that's called Lost Boston. And you look through this book, and it's pictures of all the great architectural buildings, monuments in Boston that were in existence over the past 200 years that are long gone. And you look through this book, and you long to be able to experience these magnificent creations. And it's the same thing with organs. You can look at pictures of organs, you can look at paintings of organs, but organs aren't just experienced by the eye, they're experienced by the ear, they're experienced by the soul. And your ears and your soul can experience something just through a photograph. Because the organ, as I stated before, it's an emotional experience. It's something that speaks to your soul. The Organ Historical Society started a citation program 30 years ago to raise awareness of instruments that are of spectacular cultural and historical importance. And they don't have to be large, they can be tiny little chamber organs. But the OHS, through this program, wanted to raise the awareness of the owners and of the musical society in general and the community surrounding that particular instrument as to the historical significance of that organ in the larger scheme of society. And one of the hopes of the citation is not only to say, you've got something really special here, it's to give the owners of that the idea that they need to take care of it and to preserve it, and that they need to pass it on to future generations just like it is. Because organs can be considered as sort of a living entity, they can evolve, but that doesn't necessarily always mean they should. Because if something has come to us, and it's 100, 200, 300 years old, which means that generations before us have respected it and treated it with care, that we need to have the same respect for it to pass it on to generations that are going to come 4, 5, 6 generations after us. Because like I said once, we're just passing through the life of this instrument, and we have to preserve it and take care of it. And the citation program is to let the community surrounding an instrument know how important it is, and that the community needs to embrace this instrument as a work of art and to protect it. When I see an organ discarded, it's the same reaction I have when I see a building being blown up or torn down, or a farmer's pasture being turned into development of McMansions. There's just something inside my soul that just mourns for the loss. The Organ Historical Society is a very diverse group of people. Not all of them play the organ. A lot of them have other interests. They're school teachers, they're administrators, they're bankers. They love steam trains, they love steamboats, they love travel, they love antiques, they love old buildings. They just have an emotional response to the world around them. And a lot of the members of the Organ Historical Society could sort of be considered renegades, because in 1956, when the Organ Historical Society was founded, it was a small group of people reacting to the organ establishment, the loss of valid antique musical instruments that were just being swept aside because of the attitude newer, bigger is better. And the Organ Historical Society is still a bunch of renegades today, still reacting to the larger establishment around us. And now it's not just the loss of antique pipe organs, it's also the loss of the organ in our culture being replaced with an artificial representation of the organ. And because of Muzak and whatever else, how modern society is continually bombarded with artificial music, people now accept that as okay. And the Organ Historical Society members feel very strongly about this, and they stand up and say, no, it's not okay. This is artificial, and we stand for the real. The Oregon Historical Society has a program called the Biggs Fellowship, and it was named after a very famous concert organist, E. Power Biggs, who endowed this fellowship with an endowment when he died. He left some money in trust for this to happen, and over the years everyone in the society is constantly giving money to this, and this allows us to pay for the attendance of a young individual at our conventions, and it pays for transportation, the convention, the hotel, and we've had very good success rate with getting young people involved with the society through this big fellowship.